Hi there! This video was created to provide background on the September-October Lincoln-Douglas debate topic, which is, in the United States, colleges and universities ought not consider standardized tests in undergraduate admissions decisions. When you prep for any new topic this season, your prep work should begin with identifying important words or phrases in the resolution, and first, making sure you know what they mean, and second, making sure you know why they're important. For this resolution, I've picked out 3 words and phrases that I think should help direct your research in the coming weeks. So the first, colleges and universities, second, standardized tests, and third, undergraduate admissions. Each of these are important in terms of thinking about the resolution, but as I said before, this is a good way for you to think about all topics moving forward. You should frame what you consider important to be the things that limit certain actors from the resolution, that specify the stakeholders and groups that would be affected by the policy change. When you do this, this will help you do things like generate content. You'll be able to think about how to write AFs, be able to think about the affirmative and negative ground in each resolution, which will help you generate positions on both sides, and should also give you a better sense of, if you're interested in doing a lot more T-debates on the neg, for example, thinking about the types of things that should and shouldn't be included. So with that, we're going to dive right in, starting with colleges and universities and their literal definitions, just so that we're really clear on what they are and how they function. Colleges are bodies, they're usually within larger universities that offer instruction, while universities are institutions of higher learning that conduct research and offer degrees. An example of this would be the College of Letters and Science at the University of California, Berkeley. This college exists within a larger institution to allow students to specialize in an area of study. The difference between the two is subtle, but it has important implications for the depth of research on this topic. For instance, a student may need SAT subject scores to apply to particular colleges. There's a significant degree of nuance with regard to what constitutes a college or university, which will factor into how you generate topic-specific advantages, plan and counterplan texts, and disads. Debate is a game that's won in inches, so it behooves you to take the time to get to know the ins and outs of the core actors on any topic. So keeping that in mind, here are some things that might be useful to consider in terms of your initial research. What is the role of community colleges or vocational schools in this resolution? Can they offer viable counterplan ground as institutions that usually don't require standardized test scores and admissions? Do they offer examples that prove the resolution true, or when do students attend those schools versus more selective four-year institutions? Is this something that's influenced by testing? This is barely scratching the surface, right? So we're just sort of brainstorming questions for now, but it should give you a better sense of the types of institutions that would be impacted by a change in testing policy. And hopefully going through questions like that, i.e. questioning the core actors of the resolution, can help you be creative and generate ideas in terms of what is included, what's not included, and can help you think about how to come up with interesting positions. And the next, and arguably most important phrase to think about in this resolution is standardized tests. What counts as a standardized test is negotiable in a vacuum, but this topic is trying to get to the most popular series of tests that are taken by high school juniors and seniors applying to colleges, the SAT and the ACT. There are also tests like AP and IB exams, but they're not required for admissions, so I'll keep my thoughts on them brief. I know there's a discussion about this in the Slack channel, and folks have differing opinions, but I would argue that the phrasing of the resolution directs a particular conclusion that I'll get to later. Here, I would also like to note that the phrase standardized tests in the context of this topic refers to national exams. Part of the reason I'm doing this is to help you research most efficiently. So you should avoid using or researching examples of state-specific testing, because committing time to cutting cards on state testing will make your preparation on this topic much harder than it needs to be. You may come across interesting case studies about things like STAR or other state exams, but the topic was worded to pretty explicitly place tests like those outside of its scope. I'm going to dive deeper into standardized tests later in this video, so the types of things you should focus your research energy on should become clearer after you've watched the whole thing. The last phrase that I want to touch on is undergraduate admissions. This one may seem pretty self-explanatory, but it's still important to cover so that you do your research, as I said earlier, as efficiently as possible. Especially for folks that are newer, this is going to be something that's important to think about. Undergraduate education usually refers to an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, and the use of the phrase undergraduate admissions indicates that the resolution was supposed to be limited in terms of the tests that students are meant to be researching. This is another reminder to focus your energy efficiently. You don't have to think about tests like the LSAT, the MCAT, or the GRE, and there are a lot of articles that I'm sure you'll come across that mention these exams. While they might be interesting articles, they're not necessarily helpful to you in terms of the evidence you'll find that has the most offense, that best articulates the arguments, the core points of clash in this resolution. And undergraduate admissions should also hint to you that the largest group of folks that would be affected by any change in admissions policy are high school students. Once again, this is something that's important to remember if you're trying to generate ideas or you're sort of thrown by this topic. Doing things like stakeholder analysis, i.e. analyzing who's affected by this policy on both sides, will lead you to think about high school students, their parents, teachers, the universities themselves, etc. So hopefully thinking about the topic this way can help you identify core areas you should cover in your research to give you a better idea of all of the depth of arguments that'll be made on this topic. And with that, we'll talk more specifically about common admissions tests. So standardized tests we're going to talk about in greater detail just to give you context on testing policies in the United States, as well as the primary test high school students are expected to take to get into college. As of 2008, 9 out of 10 accredited colleges and universities required students to take the SAT or ACT as part of submitting their applications. And this is just a side note, but for students that are applying, international students to American universities, they're also required to take an additional set of standardized tests, which I won't go into very much detail in this video, but it's something that you could definitely think about if that's an area that interests you. But in talking about the SAT and ACT, both of these tests are multiple choice, covering reading comprehension and math. The ACT also covers science, and they run between 3 and 4 hours long. They also include optional writing sections, and the vast majority of colleges still require students to submit these test scores, and some require SAT subjects as well. This is usually for folks that are applying to universities with a specialized major. So for example, if you're going to apply to be an engineering major at Cornell, you would take the SAT and submit SAT subject tests in chemistry or math courses. The SAT is still the most popular undergraduate admissions test and was taken by 2.1 million students last year. The main tests and all subject tests are administered through College Board, which is an organization that offers test materials and scoring information to students. Something that's important to note, might be of interest to you, each time a student takes the SAT, they have to register with College Board and pay to take the test. So for those of you that are thinking about taking a more critical approach to this topic, researching College Board is actually a pretty decent place to start, because cost can be a barrier to taking the test, especially when students are expected to submit multiple scores. If you're interested in learning more about the test itself or data about student participation, College Board publishes reports with scoring and demographic data, as well as information on the test subject matter. You can also do things like look at past exam, get feedback from students that have taken the test, and that sort of thing. The ACT is similar to the SAT in many ways. It's the second test we're going to talk about. So it covers the same content areas. It includes an optional essay as well, and it's run by another testing company called ACT Inc. Both of these companies are nonprofits. Once again, something that is a good and rich research area, given how many students take the test and the financial barriers that can be incurred by the costs of the tests that are offered by these companies. This is where folks who've proposed things like universal testing can lay the groundwork for some interesting counterplans. But getting back to the ACT proper, the ACT was taken by 1.9 million students last year, and it's gaining popularity with a lot of high school students. And as I mentioned earlier, it's also a test that you have to pay for every time that you take it, even if you're taking practice exams. Finally, they're not included on this slide, but I wanted to briefly touch on AP and IB tests. These are tests that high school students take that are associated with advanced courses that can signal to admissions officers that students were engaged in rigorous coursework and can even count for college credits. But the reason they're not the focus of this video is that they're not required for admissions, i.e., when you're applying to a college, you do not have to submit AP scores in order for your application to be considered. And I would also argue that whether or not they make a significant difference in an application is up for debate. This is another moment where I would say that focusing your energy on researching AP tests may be inefficient insofar as it may distract you from your larger research goals. AP exams may provide interesting examples of problems with standardized testing. They might be able to illustrate discrepancies between coursework offered across high schools, but they're insufficient by themselves to garner advantages or AF solvency. I only wanted to mention this because I saw some discussions in the Slack and I thought that it would be good to inject my perspective, but as I said earlier, I include this to help direct your preliminary research and to help you think through the primary points of clash on this topic. This is a suggestion and not a mandate. Things like AP and IB exams will likely show up a lot on this topic to illustrate things like discrepancies in resources at schools, i.e. there are a bunch of schools that offer these courses and schools that don't offer these courses often have lower aggregate test scores, but I don't recommend that anyone is writing an AP AF or counterplan unless you really think you can find a way to still garner enough solvency to take on the core advantages of the topic. But once again, this is less important, and this section is really just meant to give you context on the tests. So if you were unfamiliar with these admissions tests, hopefully this section gave you some background on what they consist of, who runs them, and how students access them, how many students take them. If you're stuck at any point during your research or want to gain a greater context on the tests themselves, you can always refer to the test websites to see things like aggregated test scores, testing policies, and sample questions from previous exams. And this can actually be a great place to look for evidence on who is taking these tests and test performance that's broken down through demographic data. It can be hard to find in other places. This is a pretty simple way to be able to do it if you want to gain a better sort of depth of knowledge on what you'll be drawing from in terms of evidence. And of course, given that standardized tests are taken by so many students and have been for so long, it's important to think about why they were used by admissions officers in the first place. The resolution asks debaters to question the value of using standardized tests in admissions, but there's a deep body of research that suggests standardized tests are somewhat useful for screening applicants, and there are three main reasons for this. The first is that standardized tests are meant to serve as a neutral yardstick. They're supposed to level the playing field for low-income students, for minority students, and for women and gender minorities, who, because of structural inequalities, may not have had the same access to diversity of coursework and extracurricular activities as their peers. In theory, creating a test that asks students questions that are all the exact same regardless of where they live would account for differences in wealth, grade inflation, depth of extracurricular activities, and differences in course curriculum across states. The second reason that standardized tests were used by colleges to screen applicants was that they were thought to be the best predictors of college success. Early studies of college freshmen indicated a strong relationship between SAT scores and college GPA. Because of this, admissions officers have used test scores to create cutoffs in admissions, only accepting students that are at or above a particular score. Testing was only meant to account for part of an admissions decisions, but it's long been thought of by university officials to be the best predictor of whether or not an accepted student would thrive in college courses. The best example to articulate these studies is earlier studies that were done between like the 60s and the 80s that seemed to indicate that students who had higher SAT scores had higher GPAs their freshman years of college and were able to maintain those GPAs throughout their 4 years more consistently as compared to students who had lower SAT scores. The third reason standardized tests were so widely used in undergraduate admissions is that they were meant to create measurable education standards. Within both the SAT and the ACT, there are a series of benchmarks that students are supposed to reach by the end of their high school career. So colleges use this information to confirm that students have met those standards, and school districts use the same information to monitor how their students are performing as compared with the national average. All of these reasons help explain why, as colleges, as they've gotten much more competitive within the last few decades, have turned to things like standardized tests to be able to screen multiple applicants all at once. So this is why universities have things like cutoffs. If you have 100,000 applicants, having a cutoff can immediately reduce the pool. Standardized tests were thought to be the most efficient and most fair way to do this. But of course, as we're talking about this, things have changed within the last 10 years. So something that's happened now is the test optional movement. Some colleges have started to reconsider the use of standardized tests in admissions decisions. The test optional movement was started by parents and educators to remove standardized testing from admissions decisions. This is something that will likely come up in a lot of your research because it's something that's become more popular. It's not an exact example of the resolution, so they're not getting rid of standardized tests altogether, still accepting test scores, but it could be an example of an area that you could research, and you could draw from a lot of this evidence to sort of explain why tests ought not be used. There are nearly 1,000 schools that no longer require students to submit test scores in the US, including a few that are top ranked or ranked in the top 100 best colleges and universities, which is a pretty big deal. And there are a few reasons that advocates have pushed for this change, the largest being that disadvantaged students continue to underperform on standardized tests as compared to their peers decades after the tests were created. This is one of the largest points of contention when it comes to standardized testing in general, in terms of folks that believe it should be used and folks that shouldn't. A lot of the greatest controversy in the past few years is when we're talking about this group as disadvantaged students. What does that really mean? Obviously, it depends on what you're reading, but for the most part, the literature base means for this to refer to students of color, students who identify as women or gender minorities, and students that come from economically depressed regions. Because it's likely that these students had fewer access, or had access to fewer resources, including resources to help prepare for standardized tests, the belief is that these tests weren't really made for them, and evidence indicates that even as admissions has increased for these groups over the past few decades, they continue to underperform as compared to their peers, which is what this graph is meant to indicate. It's an example that's pulled from an article that was cut on this topic called the SAT Affluence Test. As I stated before, this is one of the primary reasons that folks are against using these tests. And the other is that there's a larger shift now toward using high school GPA as a predictor of success. So as I stated earlier, there were a lot of studies that were done between 1960 and 1980 that indicated that higher SAT scores meant higher GPAs. This is something that is shifting, and a large part of this debate is focused around things like grade inflation, but there is literature that disagrees with those initial studies of SATs predictors of success that indicate that folks that had high school GPAs are also able to have high GPAs in college. This is all just food for thought, but it should give you a quick rundown on what the test optional movement is, and hopefully will indicate to you whether or not this is worth researching for you in particular, if this is something that is of interest to you. This is probably going to be the most common things that come up if you were to just Google like stuff about standardized testing. So it's important to know what's been done, what's already been done, and this is a great place to look for evidence of universities that are fairly selective, that have changed their admissions policies surrounding standardized tests, and looking at what has happened to them afterwards. So this is once again a great place to start if you feel stuck and you would like to get a better sense of what your AF should look like on this topic if you're reading like a pretty traditional AF. Which brings us to the final part of this video, which is generating content. So taking all the background that we've come up with, each of the things that we've gone through should give you a better sense of how to generate content. And as my final little tip to you, so after you've looked at the resolution, define the words you don't know, thought about the words, or the words and phrases that are important, figuring out why particular limiters are used, why particular groups are included and excluded in the resolution. If you're still having trouble coming up with ideas, a great way to do that would just be be to start with identifying stakeholders, which you can do through all of the things we've already done. So these would be the people that would be affected, people in groups, organizations that would be affected by change admissions policies. I've listed a few to help get you started, things like students, teachers, parents, test prep companies, the ACT Inc., College Board, universities themselves, that should hopefully help you get started in thinking about how to approach this topic. And with that, we're finished.